think we have 3 hours today with a short break in the middle probably, and we're gonna do a brief exploration of some of the practical ideas that Buddhism can offer in terms of our daily life and in terms of dealing with the challenges that arise both in our spiritual practice, if we're thinking about things that way, and in what we might generally label like normal existence. Because I think part of the interesting issue here is that for a Westerner, typically, there's this idea that there's religion or spirituality, esoterics or mystical practice, yoga, meditation, and things like that. And then there's our normal existence, our daily life, our work, our family, our obligations, and our ways of finding money and things like that. And sometimes these things seem not very much connected, because we feel that historically, I would even say that there's a special time set aside for spiritual practice, and there's just the rest of the time when you do your normal stuff. And the special time might be Sunday for Christians or Saturday for Jews and so on, or special prayer periods throughout the day. And there's the time you just kind of sort of trying to make it through life and be ideally a decent human being, or maybe not even so much, and there's certainly a disconnect. And another disconnect that we very much find in our Western culture intellectually is this idea that we have a heart and a mind. So we have our intellect, which is we these days associate with our brain, and we think about such things as knowledge and understanding and gaining information and processing information and ideas, and that's sort of placed here for us. And then we have our feelings and our emotions and our reactions to things, and even very deep-seated feelings such as love or affection or fear, and those are more on the emotional side, and we associate them with the heart. And it's very interesting when starting to come across Buddhism that for Buddhists these two dichotomies don't exist. There's no division into heart and mind in Buddhism, because that's all just called mind or psyche or consciousness. And there's no real division between your daily life and your spiritual practice. At least there shouldn't be from a Buddhist point of view. And so the material that we're going to be looking at today, called the 8 Verses of Mind Training, is really all about bringing this reinvigorating understanding that the Buddha brought about initially 2,500 years ago into every aspect of our existence. Trying to see how all these ideas and these practices and these methods, meditation techniques and whatnot, can really affect the quality of our life. So one of my teachers is a revered Tibetan master, but most of the time teaches in English, or at least his own version of English. He says sometimes that Buddhism is really a system of practices that allows us to become skillful in our life. Just like you can become a skillful violin player or piano player or coder, or gain mastery in any technique or any profession or any job, basically anything, including knitting and riding a bicycle and swimming and so on. You can similarly gain an incredible amount of skill in dealing with the challenges of daily life. I think that's one very important thing that we have to keep in mind when we come across monasteries and prayer flags and mantras and rosaries and things like that, which here in Kathmandu Valley surround us very closely. We see lots of Buddhist imagery around. We certainly see a lot of Hindu temples as well, and these two traditions are closely interconnected. And if we go to the several Buddhist spots around here, such as this Bodhanath Stupa or Svayambhunath Stupa, Kopan Monastery, and other places like that, we will certainly see a profusion of these sacred images. We will see photographs of lamas, we will see monks and nuns dressed in their robes. We'll see many texts that seem completely arcane and mysterious, especially in the Tibetan tradition, where there's a very strong literary tradition of writing on all sorts of very high-profile topics. And it might all feel very distant, and for some people that actually provides a certain subconscious relief. They go towards these deep end practices, such as mantras and so forth, or start living in a monastery, or start doing retreat after retreat, and sort of find certain escape there from the banality of existence or from the challenges of living. And after a while, they re-emerge and they go back to their families or to their work or back to their home country, and quite often face the challenge of not being able to very effectively translate their understanding of Buddhism into simple tasks such as dealing with your family. And it's quite a running joke that being able to talk nicely to your family is the greatest challenge for your enlightenment. So if you're wondering if you're enlightened or not, come back to your family, Thanksgiving dinner, something like that. Try to be civil to everyone without getting irritated, and being skillful and talking to everyone. That's a big thing. So when the Dalai Lama teaches Buddhism, and he's of course one of the lamas that are most familiar with the challenges of daily existence in modern life, he never starts with the things that are completely out of reach for our mundane understanding. He never starts talking about, for example, the tantric practices of Buddhism, which have to do with our energies and channels and chakras and so forth. Never. He also doesn't even necessarily go straight into the intricacies of Buddhist philosophy, although that's also a thing. But he certainly very often talks about very simple, very basic things that for some people seem even too foundational. He always, in the beginning of every talk he gives, Buddhist or secular, says, for example, that every sentient being, so all the humans and all the animals and all the dogs and ants and cats and cows and anybody, invisible beings as well if we accept their existence, every sentient being wants happiness and doesn't want to suffer. So the Dalai Lama giving a talk just throws it out there, and then the audience is left to think about that. And very often, when people are just coming in contact with the Dharma, or with the Dalai Lama personally, you would hear things like, well, yeah, we knew that. Like, that's not a great idea necessarily, because it's obvious. It's obvious everybody wants to have happiness, doesn't want to suffer. It's obvious we need to have love and compassion. It's obvious that there is interdependence between beings and between countries and so on. And it's also quite obvious that as good people, not even necessarily Buddhist, we might want to practice nonviolence. And so that's the initial reaction quite often. I've heard Robert Thurman even once say that he was at a talk that the Dalai Lama was giving in America, and the Dalai Lama said what I basically just quoted, like, all beings want happiness and don't want to suffer. And the person sitting next to Robert Thurman said, well, with that sort of wisdom, no wonder the Chinese occupied them, because to him that seemed like such a trite thought, such a simplistic explanation of life, such a surface level statement that he didn't see any value in it. But also, at the same time, when we really start going deep into that idea and we try to apply it to daily life by learning to see every being as a being that wants to be happy and doesn't want to suffer, including in conflict situations where our vision is not at all that, including in situations where we're completely focused on ourselves and withdrawn from others and feel very preoccupied with our own suffering and are not at all capable of thinking of others. So learning to apply that very simple statement that the Dalai Lama gives is already in itself a big practical challenge. It's already in itself a Buddhist practice, and it's one of the most profound Buddhist practices because it completely changes our perception of ourselves and others. But because the statement in itself doesn't provide enough guidance, perhaps, and we're not really taught to take a simple thought like that, every being wants to be happy, and then analyze it and then meditate on it, we're not taught to do those things. We need further guidance. We basically need more elaborate instructions, right? And that's where all the incredibly rich body of Buddhist literature throughout all the three major traditions comes in. We know that there's the so-called Southern Buddhism, which is mostly widespread spread in the southern countries such as Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, parts of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And then there's the two branches of the Northern Buddhism, which are the Tibetan branch, which also covers Mongolia, parts of Russia, here in Nepal, Bhutan, some regions in India, and the Far Eastern branch, which is China, Japan, Korea, parts of Vietnam. So we'll look at the incredible profusion of texts in these traditions, and even in the Tibetan tradition alone, just the word of the Buddha himself is 108 volumes. And then the Indian commentaries on that work is 220 volumes. And then the amount of volumes that the Tibetans wrote throughout the history of Buddhism in Tibet is just beyond comprehension. It's like thousands upon thousands of different texts. When we look at that and we are like, can I get a simple instruction perhaps? In Christianity they have the Bible, in Islam they have a Quran, and of course there's more literature than that, but at least that's sort of a good beginning. And to put it simply, the Tibetan tradition doesn't necessarily always answer yes. It doesn't say, oh, you have just this one book that everybody reads that's like the short guide to all the wisdom and all the practices and all the meditations. No. But at the same time, you do have certain favorite classics. Different texts, short or long. Some of them might be a couple of volumes in length. Some of them might be half a page, four lines even. One line, there's one text that's just one letter, and it contains a whole teaching in it. You do have those favorite classics in the Tibetan tradition, and you, in coming in contact with the Tibetan Buddhism again and again, in attending events or just reading books or just looking for videos online or audio recordings and whatnot, you would be seeing those texts or those genres surface again and again. And so the text that we're going to look is one of those favorites for Tibetans. It's a Tibetan text. It was written on the basis of the Buddhist teachings and then the Indian commentaries to the Buddhist teachings. But it was written in Tibet in the 11th century. And it was written in an attempt to condense some of the important practices for training our mind into a very short, unelaborate form that we could always easily access. So when you would be attending teachings by the Dalai Lama, which is quite easy these days, it's becoming a bit more difficult because he doesn't travel internationally anymore, but you can still come to Dharamsala in India where he lives and attend 3 or 4 days of teachings publicly, usually in the fall. When you would be attending teachings by the Dalai Lama, you would see that quite often, even when he's teaching on other texts, he would insert this one as well. Because sometimes he's teaching on things that are quite advanced, complicated to understand, have to do with the nature of reality and things such as emptiness and interdependence and profound ways of meditating on those, or, for example, the functions and the structure of our mind, our consciousness, the different levels of it, and so on. And that's all taking time to absorb. Many people, when coming in contact with those advanced teachings, very honestly admit that it's quite challenging to understand all of this. It will take time, it will take study, it will take reflection, it will take, in some cases, debate or public discussion or group discussion, and it will take some meditation as well. But basically, just as I've said now, it will take time. Buddhism takes time to absorb. But at the same time, while teaching on those advanced topics, the Dalai Lama always wants to give us some sort of simple thing that we can practice straight away. And this text is his personal favorite for specifically that. So I'll give you these handouts. Before I do, just a brief note that in the Tibetan tradition, it's a custom not to put Dharma text on the floor, because that's considered not very respectful. So if you can keep it on your lap, or in your hands, or on your bag, or somewhere, that would be nice. And this handout is the verses themselves, the 8 verses, and some practical points that I've extracted from a commentary by the Dalai Lama. There are several commentaries by the Dalai Lama in English. Thank you. And I very much recommend this one. Here at the very top you see a quote from the Dalai Lama himself. He says, "I recite the 8 verses of mind training by Langri Tangpa every day and regularly apply it to my life. When I'm delayed at an airport, I reflect on these verses, and before going into potentially difficult situations, I contemplate them as well. So this specific commentary is from his book called Approaching the Buddhist Path. It's actually a product of collaboration between the Dalai Lama and his long-term American disciple, Venerable Thupten Chodron, was one of my main teachers, and I think Holly knows her as well. And this specific book, Approaching the Buddhist Path, is a part of a series of volumes that the Dalai Lama and Thupten Chodron specifically prepared to introduce Westerners to Buddhism in a way that would be comprehensible. Because for several decades, while Buddhism was coming to the West, specifically to America and Western Europe, there were some problems with understanding some of the key foundational concepts that for Tibetans are a given. They don't question them, they don't challenge them. So, for example, reincarnation. If you live in the Tibetan society, unless you belong to a very small Muslim community, you would be following either Tibetan Buddhism or the Bon tradition, which is very similar, and both of these traditions accept reincarnation as a given. They don't really ask questions about it much. But at the same time, when Westerners come to Buddhism, there's quite a lot of questions about reincarnation. For many people, it's emotionally challenging to try to accept that. For others, there's just no way of clearly understanding how exactly it happens from the Buddhist point of view, because Buddhists don't share the Hindu understanding of reincarnation. There's certain differences. And there's just a lot to unpack, and a lot to process. So things like that, things like nature of the mind, emotions, reincarnation, understanding whether a particular teaching is valid or not, analyzing Buddha's teachings to see whether they actually make any sense. These are the things that are covered in that book and the volume that follow after that. But one of the chapters in the book is just an explanation of the importance of love and compassion, which is something that the Dalai Lama always talks about. Love and compassion as the universal values that can be applied regardless of whether we're Buddhist or not. And then within that chapter, as a practical guidance to how to use compassion in our daily life, he's presenting this commentary on the 8 verses, as he says here himself. That's part of his own daily meditation. I've taken teachings from him on this text quite a number of times, and from some of my other teachers as well. And the points underneath the verses here are just summary of what he says in the commentary. So you can find the book itself. It's available electronically and in print form. And I think maybe the first volume has even been published in Spanish, or will be, because there is a group that's working on that. But other than that, you will see that the commentary itself is quite short and simple. But we don't have that much time. Reading from the commentary itself would have taken more time than we have, so I've prepared this simplified handout. So the translation of the verses that we have here is from Venerable Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who is the spiritual director of this center and the main Lama in Kopan Monastery. He will be coming to Nepal in 2 or 3 weeks to teach during the course that you're attending. And there's quite a lot of teachings on this text from Lama Zopa available online as well. That's one of the favorites of all the main teachers in the Tibetan tradition, basically, but especially studied in the Gelug school that Kopan Monastery belongs to, even though it's quite universally accepted and studied as well. So we're following Lama Zopa's translation and the Dalai Lama's commentary. That's just for clarity. Yeah?
Could you explain what a lama is?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Lama basically is the Tibetan translation of the Sanskrit word guru, although the etymology is a little bit different. The guru in Sanskrit, if you unpack the 2 syllables, means something like heavy with qualities. And I found another etymological explanation that's that bringer of light. But regardless of etymology, we know that guru in the Indian traditions, universally, not just in Buddhism, but also Hinduism, Sikhism, Jainism, and nowadays in the West as well, guru is an esteemed spiritual teacher that you ideally have carefully checked and then entrusted yourselves to. In Tibetan, when the word lama is used, it can have 2 slightly different meanings. It can be simply the analogy of the word guru. So anybody who has spiritual students and who is able to provide spiritual instruction can be called a guru. That's one use. But another use that's more specific for the Tibetan tradition is that sometimes Lama is a formal title awarded to people who have done a sufficient amount of formal retreat. So sometimes people would do 3-year retreat or several 3-year retreats, and they would literally get a certificate that says they're now a retreat Lama. That doesn't necessarily mean that they already have students, and that doesn't necessarily mean they are qualified to teach. So you have these two uses, and in the West it's quite important to not just take anything at face value when somebody's called a Lama. It's also not always a Lama in a genuine sense. What the Buddhist tradition encourages us to do is to check the qualities, the qualifications, the ethical behavior, the knowledge that a particular person has, and then if we do see that they're valid, if we do see that their style is good for us, and if we do see that we as a student are ready to entrust ourselves to the process and do a certain amount of practice at least, then they become our Lama. So for example, with the Dalai Lama, the Lama here is just honorary way of calling his position historically. That's the title that the Mongolians awarded to, believe, the third Dalai Lama after he passed away. And so all the Dalai Lamas after the third one were called the Dalai Lama, which from Mongolians translates as ocean of wisdom, I think. And at the same time, the title Dalai Lama doesn't imply that Dalai Lama is our Lama. I mean, in my case, he is, because I've checked him as my teacher. I've taken a lot of teachings from him, taken some personal instruction even, and I have a guru-disciple relationship with him. For many people, he's just a person with that title, maybe a nice guy that smiles a lot and has nice jokes and talks about love and compassion and so forth. But we do have the freedom to check him as a spiritual teacher, and if we see that he's valid and we see his teachings, like this commentary, make sense, then we might eventually build sort of a personal relationship even. It doesn't mean we'll be able to email him with requests for advice, but certainly it would mean that his instructions given in books and in public teachings and so on are especially meaningful for us personally. So that's the significance. Lama in Tibetan means something like high mother, because ma is a feminine ending, and la stands for lana mepa, which is unsurpassed. So a lama in Tibetan language has this connotation of being a caring mother for a disciple. But one can only be a caring mother for a disciple if one has strong levels of understanding, ethical behavior, and practical experience. So there's always that importance of checking the teacher and then entrusting ourselves. The same goes actually for everything that's said in this text. This text is quite outrageous in what it suggests. It's quite radical. And then when we first see text like that, it's perfectly valid actually to say, this doesn't make any sense. And maybe it doesn't. You know, not everything in Buddhist texts always makes sense or is still relevant. There's definitely things that are now not accepted as part of the valid teachings. And this has been historically so. Even the earliest Indian teachers that were writing all those commentaries, they were very carefully scrutinizing texts attributed to the Buddha himself, or texts supposedly containing the Buddha's word. The Buddha didn't write any text himself, but there were later recorded versions of those. And some of these Indian teachers, such as the famous Nagarjuna, they were analyzing those and seeing whether they make any sense in terms of logic, reason, and direct experience. So for example, one thing in the Buddhist tradition is that it has this sort of mythological explanation of the universe as consisting of a giant mountain in the center, and then there are 4 continents around it and 8 subcontinents, and that's how the world exists, basically. And there's sun and moon kind of making circles around the mountain. And if we look at the Earth, we see that that's not how Earth is organized geographically. So that's a challenge in itself. And then you're left with a question then, well, what to do with it? And it is at least the Dalai Lama's position that this explanation of world as consisting of these things is not to be taken literally at all, obviously. It contradicts direct experience. We might find metaphorical explanations for it, or we might think that the giant mountain is actually a symbol for the giant black hole that is found in the center of each galaxy, and la-di-da. We can find alternative explanations and meditative explanations, metaphorical explanations. But we cannot be with a straight face telling people, actually, the world consists of 8 subcontinents, 4 continents, and a giant mountain in the center, because it doesn't. So, similarly, if these verses, after careful analysis, make no sense, the Dalai Lama says, just forget about that. Or as one of my other teachers say, just eat fruit. Forget about everything that we discussed. If it doesn't make any sense to just enjoy life and have some fruit. Basically, be happy. What else is there to do? But perhaps there is some value in it, and we shouldn't necessarily be immediately turning away from this material just because it's new to us. We need to analyze it, think about it, see if there's any value, any validity, any reason. And one thing that especially encourages us to study this is knowing that there have been generations of yogis who have been using this text and many other Buddhist texts to train their mind. And then what's the result of that training? They should have developed what we in the West call these days emotional intelligence to a very, very great degree. So then we're looking at Tibetans of the older generation, Tibetan yogis specifically, and we see whether they have developed emotional intelligence to a great degree, perhaps a greater degree that we ourselves now possess. And I can say from personal experience that at least 2 of my teachers have been in concentration camps for 20 plus years. Both of them, one of them has passed away, and one of them is still alive, teaching in Arizona. Both of them later said that for them, staying in concentration camps, despite very difficult conditions and torture, basically, and being in prison, and Chinese prisons for Tibetans are not at all easy. There's not like prisons in Denmark, where you get every sort of comfort you want. Later they said that these years were the happiest years of their lives. Not because they were in prison, there's nothing happy about that, but because they were constantly practicing transforming their mind. They're constantly meditating, constantly practicing compassion and love for their fellow prisoners, but also developing incredible levels of compassion, understanding, and empathy for the torturers. So even that alone, if we don't believe in reincarnation or miracles or things like that, karma, past lives, future lives, which are actually quite foundational for Buddhism, even just hearing that somebody trained their mind so well that they were able to transform 20 years in a concentration camp into the happiest years of their lives, even that makes us think, maybe there is something to it. And the teachings these masters were practicing to make that happen were specifically these teachings. The 8 verses of training the mind, and some other texts with the same mind training in the title. And Tibetans have actually quite a nice array of mind training literature. Most of it is actually available in English. There's a very nice compilation translated by Lobsang Tenpa. It's just called Mind Training. And it's a bunch of texts like this. But this one is very short, and that's why the Dalai Lama very often teaches it. You can also say, and that's just as an aside, that if we eventually start to study the whole of the Buddhist path, and that's specifically what's taught in, for example, the Kopan 1-month course, where the teacher, the main Western teacher, takes you through all the stages of the path. So all the meditations that you are to do on the path from now, where we are all complete beginners, to actually attaining deep realizations into the nature of reality, deep meditative realizations. So when you start studying sequences of steps like that, usually, quite often, they're taught on the basis of elaborate texts. For example, one of the beloved texts in the Gelug tradition, the great treatise on the stages of the path to awakening, in English is published in 3 volumes. That's a big text, like 3 thick books. But then, after you've studied all of that and you've contemplated it and you've maybe done some of the meditations on it, and you have some practical experience, you come back to like this text. It's just 8 verses. Without the commentary, it would be like half a page. You come back to this and you look at it and you see that actually all the main points of that big one, the elaborate explanation, were already contained in a simple text like this. There's a simple text that's just 4 lines. It contains all the stages of the path. There's this text which contains 8 verses. All of the essence is already there. But it takes time and experience to be able to unpack that. And at least even where we're still not able to do that because we just don't know enough or we don't have enough practical experience, it's perfectly fine to just look at the literal meaning, which is what we're going to do right now, going through the verses one by one. So before we start with verse 1, another thing to explain here is the concept of mind training. What's the deal with that? And in Tibetan, that's a very nice word that you would frequently be hearing in Tibetan tradition. And the word is lo jong. That's the Tibetan word for it. Lo jong. Lo is the root that can be translated as mind or intellect or thinking. And it, in some cases, can denote just our conceptual thinking or our intellect, our ability to analyze and process information. In some contexts, law can just mean mind in general. But here in this context, in the word lojong, law specifically means attitude, our attitude towards something. And it's actually quite important to think about, because what we don't usually understand when we're not looking closely at our mind through therapy or through Buddhist practice or through any other psychological technique is that basically throughout the day, 99% of the time, we're seeing the world through our attitudes, or we can say our interpretations, our conceptual ideas about things. One of the reasons popular mindfulness is becoming so widespread is that popular mindfulness contains techniques for withholding our conceptual thinking, our conceptual ideas about things, and just looking at the thing itself, and at least in terms of our ability to see, our ability to hear, our ability to smell, and to notice tactile sensations and tastes. So when you're practicing popular mindfulness, you would, for example, be meditating on the sound. It's quite a widespread technique. And we would just be sitting here and mindfully, that is with applied attention, listening to the sounds outside. We can already do that right now. There's no meditation involved in just listening. But when we're practicing popular mindfulness, what we're also doing is withholding our judgments about the thing. So there are birds, and there are people, and there are cars, and if we were practicing mindfulness meditation on the sound, we would be just noticing the sound as the sound. Even though popular mindfulness kind of put its own spin on the thing, that actually does come back to the Buddha himself, because in one of his most important teachings in the Pali language, the Buddha said, "In the herd, let there be just the herd." So not my opinion of the bird sound, not my feeling of whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, but just the sound itself. That in itself is valuable because it teaches us to see the difference between our conceptual projection and the thing itself. And we would see throughout society, and maybe amongst our friends, difference in how passionate we are about projecting things. So we would have friends necessarily that if you ask them, "What do you think about this ball?" would say, "Not much. I mean, it's a singing ball, what else is there to say?" And we would have friends that just by looking at this thing once would have a strong opinion about it. They would strongly react to it by saying, "Oh my God, I love it, it's amazing, it looks so authentic, it's so dark, and it's made from metal, and it's just the right style, and I love it." But most of the time, people with a lot of opinions would be expressing negative views. So we might have a friend that just by looking at the thing would be saying, "Oh my God, it's ugly. It's disgusting. I don't like it. Take it away. It's not the best kind. I much prefer golden looking ones, things like that. And we might even notice that in ourselves. Do we often have an opinion on everything that's happening in the world? And some people do and some people don't. That's different personalities for you. But the important part here is that we are becoming more awake already. We're already becoming a tiny bit closer to the state of a Buddha, to the state of enlightenment, when we start noticing that our mind is an opinion factory. It's an attitude factory. And most of the times our opinions and our attitudes, sort of the same thing here, they're not freely created. We're not creating them from scratch. We don't have a blank page in front of us and we just decide, oh, I'm going to like this thing, or I'm going to not like this thing. I'm going to like this person. I'm going to dislike this person. It's completely 100% coming from our conditioning, initially. If we start practicing, even just mindfulness alone, let alone teachings like this, we are learning to have more freedom about our attitudes. And we're learning to notice them, to analyze them, and to replace the ones that are not wholesome, that is not conducive for happiness, with ones that are conducive for happiness. So you see that in the example of the concentration camps and the lamas who stayed there for 20 years. They were in a situation that they had no ability to change from the outside. They couldn't just break through a wall. They couldn't just leave on their own. Eventually, through certain miracle, they were released, and they were both able to come to India, and one of them eventually came to the States. But many other lamas were not released and died in the concentration camp. Hundreds of thousands of Tibetans died there. So there's not much that you can do in terms of the outer situation. Or even on a more mundane level, sometimes you're just stuck in a traffic jam. A very simple situation that happens here in Kathmandu a lot. You're stuck on a dusty road. It's very dusty. You're sitting there in your mask, or even without a mask. Your driver is trying to get you through, maybe to the airport. Maybe you're already late for a flight, And there's really nothing you can do from the outer point of view. You cannot make the car go faster. You cannot push your driver more. I mean, you can, but it's not going to be good for either him or you because it's dangerous. So there's not much you can do, really, on the outer level. And then all you have left is your mind, synonymous here with your heart, your attitudes, and your experience of the situation, which can be neutral, sort of, yeah, fine, whatever. Positive, I'm gaining some benefit from the situation. Or just negative, you're sitting there angry and frustrated and afraid and despising everyone around, and things like that. So that's pretty much the choice we have. Every situation we encounter is either neutral for us, or it's pleasant or unpleasant. But what evokes those feelings, what makes the situation one of these three things, is the attitude in our mind towards it. Very simple example that is frequently given when these teachings are explained. Let's imagine we do a meditation in the Shavasana position now, right? We're all just lie down on the floor and we're nicely relaxed and we're meditating and we're observing our breath, and suddenly I start walking over your body. I can guess pretty accurately you would not be too happy with me walking over you when you're in meditation. At the same time, let's imagine you go for a thigh massage. The massage therapist is walking on your back, but you're not reacting negatively to sensations that are actually quite painful from a physical point of view, because that's something you paid for. It's supposedly good for your muscles. It might even heal you from certain physical disorders. Massage is good. We have that cultural idea, and so on. So a completely different reaction to the same set of physical sensations, and the same thing happening to you from the outer point of view. There's a person walking on your back. So there is a difference that is completely dependent on our conceptual interpretation of the thing. And although there's a lot that goes into our conceptual interpretation of certain impersonal situations, such as being in a traffic jam, or getting a sickness, or being fired, there's many more problems that come about through our interaction with beings, through our personal relationships. The most painful experiences in our life are usually experiences that have to do with other people. And from an observation point of view, and also from some of the research I've seen on the topic, obviously one of the most painful things in our life is being rejected by others. So being romantically dumped by someone, like your partner packs and leaves or cheats on you or something like that, or just feeling isolated by other beings. Like you're in your workplace and you're already seeing you're not going to be friends with any of these people because they don't want to talk to you. And no matter how much you try to talk to them and be nice and bring cakes and talk about yourself or ask about their day, they're not trying to establish nice communication with you. It's one of the most painful things that happen, let alone being bullied, which can really drive you, make you very traumatized and bring about violence even, which is what happens a lot in schools. So dealing with other beings is a more critical issue here than just dealing with impersonal situations. And it's for this reason that the 8 verses all have to do with other beings. You will see other mind training texts, Lobsang texts, that talk about how to transform illness, for example, or sickness, or just basically anything that happens to you. 8 verses, because they need to be so concise, specifically talk about other beings. And then we can extrapolate their lessons into impersonal situations as well, or just study those extra teachings. First, we start with other beings, and this is what this text is about. And so law is our attitude, which we need to start noticing and changing. And jong literally means to transform, but another translation of the same verbal root is to purify, to refine. So we can purify our attitudes, we can transform our attitudes. And even just knowing that I can change my interpretation of the thing is already a very liberating thought, actually. But also a very difficult thought in many cases. Because we're sort of unskillful with how we talk to each other about these things. And it's not uncommon for Buddhists to sort of try to use mind training teachings to, bang their friends on the head when the friends are down. So your friend literally has just been dumped by her boyfriend, right? She's crying, she's a mess, she's in a lot of emotional pain. Maybe that's the strongest emotional pain she has had in her life, because that's a big thing. And then we're like, oh, don't worry, don't cry, just use mind training teachings, you can change your attitude. No, that's not going to be helpful. We need to apply these teachings beforehand. And then when we see that our friend is breaking down because something painful has happened, we need to provide emotional support. Give them hugs, make sure they're okay, take them to a therapist if needed, listen to them, brew tea, take them around, do everything that's reasonable in terms of emotional support. Then, later, we can all together come back to these mind training teachings and start practicing them again and again and again, so that we're better prepared for the next difficult thing that's going to happen in our life. Because one thing that the Buddha has stated as his very first teaching, life by nature implies discomfort. Or is it sometimes translated, there is suffering in life, or life is suffering, which is almost an incorrect translation. This life implies discomfort. So we know there are going to be problematic situations arising. We prepare ourselves for those by practicing teachings like this. Any questions about the general idea of Lobsang, mind training, changing our attitudes? If not, let's look at the verses. We'll make a short break, sort of somewhere through the middle. So, the first verse written by Langri Tangpa, this wonderful Tibetan master, who also wrote some other texts on mind training as well, and here translated by Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Determined to obtain the greatest possible benefit from all sentient beings, who are more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel, I shall hold them most dear at all times. So, we need to unpack the meaning, right? We need to understand what these words mean. And sentient beings here is any being, from the Buddhist point of view, any being that has consciousness or mind. And here you would see certain differences between the biological understanding and Buddhist understanding, because biologists are currently in the process of trying to understand which beings do have consciousness. And it was actually for a long time the working theory that most animals don't have consciousness at all. They have certain psychic functions, they have neural system, but they don't have consciousness in the same way that people, humans, and higher primates do. It's obviously changing. Some countries are even adopting laws that state that all animals are to be considered sentient beings, but it's at the same time still not a universal understanding yet. We're quite inhumane when it comes to animals. But from a Buddhist point of view, all humans are sentient. They have minds. They're mind possessors, as it's called in Tibetan. All animals are. Insects, birds, fish, and also many types of minute beings, so very small beings. It's said that there are 27 billion types of sentient beings living inside our body at any given moment. So even that. And different types of beings that to our eye are invisible but are said to be perceptible for realized masters and sometimes people who have brought certain type of clairvoyance from their past lives. So we all know about spirits and ghosts and gods and demons and things like that. All of that is part of the Buddhist worldview. And the important thing here is to understand that from the Buddhist point of view, every one of these mind possessors has basically the same psychology. They have the same sort of, very generically speaking, mind that has the same functions. So all sentient beings have the mental function of anger, for example, or desire, or love, or compassion. And they might be activated to a different degree, but the general raw material is similar. Yes?
Bacteria and virus don't have.
That's a very good question. There's a big discussion about bacteria and viruses. Virus, even in biology as well, whether virus is a being or just a reproducing mechanism is a big issue. With bacteria, I've heard some masters confidently say that they should be considered sentient beings, and I've heard some others say that it's an open question. That's the sort of questions that are discussed by the Dalai Lama in his annual conferences with scientists. So there's a very well-known sequence of conferences called Mind and Life conferences. They happen every year, sometimes twice a year, and that's where the Dalai Lama has the dialogue, and some other Buddhist masters. They have the dialogue with world-leading quantum physicists, psychologists, neurophysiologists, biologists, and so on. And so these are the sorts of questions that they discuss from a scientific point of view and Buddhist point of view. And usually there's always a book published after the conference. There's a lot of reading material to see the fine points of these discussions.
But right now, permit to use the antibiotic?
That's also a good question because there's even if bacteria are sentient beings, then there's the question is, well, should we just die and I'll let them have our body? And wouldn't all the other bacteria that live in our body also die if our body dies? Or should we leave because we as humans have a more ability to benefit others and to come to awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings? And that's the fine point of Buddhist ethics that is discussed in great detail when we are learning teachings on karma. Basically, there is no concept of being permitted or not permitted in Buddhism. So it's never like, oh, Buddha allows you to, like, gives you a free pass to use antibiotics, or kill intestinal worms of your body. But it's also not like the Buddha is gonna send you to hell for doing that. It's all about karma and the imprints we create through doing those things. And there's a lot of fine considerations that go into dealing with bacteria, dealing with intestinal worms, dealing with humans, when we have, for example, have to be strict or restrict someone from harming others and so on. And as we learn those things and as we meditate on compassion and wisdom more and more, we are able to take wiser and wiser decisions in each specific situation. Of course, the best option is to stay healthy and not have to use antibiotics. That's the safe bet. But good luck with that, So then we're trying to make informed choices, and as we progress on the path, our choices will be more and more informed. So that's the sentient beings part. And then it says here that we're determined to obtain the greatest possible benefit from them. And it also says that they're more precious than wish-fulfilling jewel. So the greatest possible benefit that we can get from sentient beings, from the Buddhist point of view, is becoming a fully awakened Buddha, a fully awakened being. That's the greatest type of happiness that we can experience, and the state of a Buddha is described as the utmost level of psychological evolution. So right now, our psychological evolution is that of a human being, right? And as a human being, we have more freedom, for example, than an animal, because we have certain cognitive functions that an animal doesn't have. For example, it's said quite universally that animals are not capable of contemplating their death in advance. And most animals, although there are exceptions, are not really able of expressing a lot of care for those outside of their own biological species. So it's very common, for example, for mother dog to be taking care of their puppies, but then she sees a cat and she will, with clear conscience, tear that cat apart. You know, it's quite common to observe things like that. Animals have, there are exceptions, of course, but that's one thing that we observe in nature. Or, for example, we see a lioness, and she's quite caring with her cubs, their babies, but then she's completely ruthless with the deer that she kills and feasts on, and then later feeds her cubs once again. So she doesn't perceive that deer in a very compassionate way, obviously. As humans, we have the unique opportunity to develop universal compassion to all the other types of humans, all the other social groups and so on, and also to all the other types of sentient beings universally. Even if we have to take antibiotics for survival, that doesn't preclude us from having informed compassion for the beings we're forced to kill in that moment. So that's something unique about our cognitive functions right now. We have this, what the Dalai Lama calls, incredible human intelligence. But then the Buddhist hypothesis, and that's testable, is that we can progress on the spiritual path and gain greater levels of psychological development. And in the Buddhist teachings, there's a very clear explanation of how each of these progressive stages looks, like what's experienced in terms of our mind. And then eventually, the highest stage of evolution is what is called a Buddha. And so there are many Buddhas, many beings who have progressed to that stage. The historical Buddha was just one example of that. But he taught the path so that others might follow it and gain the same results. And there were obviously Buddhas before him, and there will also be Buddhas after the Earth as a planet no longer exists, because it's just a universal stage of development that one might come to through applied effort. So that stage of development, being a Buddha, is described as having completely eliminated all the disturbing mental aspects. So all the anger, all the fear, all the jealousy, all the afflicted pride, all the neurotic desire, depression, anxiety, etc., etc., etc. And having developed to infinite completeness all the positive qualities such as loving kindness, compassion, wisdom, understanding of interdependence, understanding of causes and effects, seeing the impermanence in action, and so forth and so forth and so forth. So not just having less fear, more compassion, but having no fear and having limitless compassion. One should admit that for us right now, that's not a psychological state we can really imagine, at least emotionally. We can conceptually understand it, perhaps. We can describe it like on a piece of paper. I just talked about it, so if I gave you a piece of paper and I said, can you write down what is a Buddha in your own words, you would write down, oh, it's a being that has completely purified its mind and has completely developed all the positive qualities. It's very hard for us to imagine that experientially. The great news is, even conceptual understanding in itself is quite sweet. It's something that might inspire us to maybe to start making the first steps. And then as we're having the gradual stages of realization, which are all well described in the literature and certainly are still attained to this day by practitioners, we will be able to see how our mind unfolds. So in the beginning our mind was like this, but when through applied intense practice, we're just getting our first realizations on the path, and our mind is starting to open up a little bit. And even seeing that experiential difference would be mind-blowing. It would be mind-blowing how different our mind feels, subjectively, once we have made the first step. And then we will get incredible hunger for the next step after that, because we will be saying, wow, if I'm so much freer here, how much happier would I be on the next stage? And then the next stage, and then the next stage. And then eventually, we come towards the state of a Buddha, knowing that the Buddhahood is the full unfolding of that potential. But it takes time, and it takes experiment, and it takes applied effort. But certainly, there are a lot of explanations and a lot of teachings out there that from the very onset inspire us to want that, the greatest possible benefit. At the same time, this verse also talks about other types of benefit that are gained from others. And this is where the Dalai Lama specifically always insists that we need to be contemplating the interdependence of all the beings, or meditating actually, as an applied practice, using guided meditations or guiding ourselves, meditating on the kindness of all the other beings, which is a classical traditional meditation in the Tibetan lineage. So in that we just contemplate how everything that is around us came from others. So obviously all the physical things, certainly. I've not made my clothes, I've not made my food, I certainly didn't grow it. Even if I cooked it, all the staples came from someone else, and not just one being. It wasn't just one happy farmer, planting all the 7 billion types of plants and then bringing them over to me. It was a huge chain of numerous human beings, plus all the animals involved in the process, and all the ants that were killed while plowing the field, and if we're a meat eater, or if we drink dairy and so on, all these animals as well. But even if we're not, there's still a lot of insects that die when making vegetarian or vegan food. So all those beings as well, all together, are just the source of my food right now. And not just all the beings that are alive right now, all the beings that have preceded these. Like if we have a cow right now, it has certainly evolved from something back to the days of amoebas in the ocean, And if we have me right now, my body itself has evolved from something, like the physical body that I'm using. And same thing with everything else. It's just endless chains of interdependence where literally, it could be said validly, everything that's happening right now is the result of absolutely everything that happened in the future. In the past, sort of like the butterfly effect to the 10th time. Because there's no way I could be having a tea bag and some water in my cup if everything since the Big Bang and preceding the Big Bang didn't lead up to this cup being made, this tea bag being made, and this water being in existence to be, boiled and poured into the cup. So right now, when we describe it like this, it might seem as just an intellectual exercise. The point here is to actually go deep into that thought, and that's called analytical meditation, which is literally relax our body, relax our mind to a certain degree, and then we actually go through the sequence of thoughts until we arrive at a very strong and immediate impression that, yes, I do depend on other beings, on their kindness, in everything that I have, at least physically. We just talked about the physical. From that springs forth a sense of appreciation. That's actually a specific mental function in the Buddhist psychology. We appreciate. And a sense of gratitude and respect. Like, I can be very vegan, or I can be very much a meat eater, but either way, I have to be incredibly grateful for all the beings that have brought about my food. Just that. Which is actually interesting because I'm seeing that sometimes people are not really interested in Buddhism as a whole, or for example, mindfulness practices as a whole, but there are several very nice books about how to apply Buddhism just to your cooking, or just to your eating, or to apply popular, secularized mindfulness just to eating, and just to cooking. And a huge part of that is these practices where we contemplate the interdependence and the gratitude, and the love and compassion we should naturally feel to all the beings that have been the source of all of this. So yes, perhaps having tea in my cup, or this table, or this paper, or the iPad and all that, that's not the greatest possible benefit, as in, that's not awakening. But we could also say that's a pretty great benefit, pretty great, incredible thing, which we call life. You know, I'm alive right now. I have all these opportunities. I have all these pleasant, beautiful experiences around me. Not to romanticize or anything. There's a lot of difficult things that happen as well. But I am existent, and wow, how incredible! And all that came through the kindness of others, including my parents, including all of my school teachers, including all of my bullies, including all the people who are completely against my political views and whatnot. They are all also part of the same interdependence. So we are, as you can see here in the commentary, in terms of thoughts and meditations, for this verse, contemplating interdependence, how every being is connected to all the other beings. Kindness of others, how every being brings about the chains of benefit that we're all connected to. And the third point here is learning to see other beings as real subjects of experience. That's not a given. So, unless we are quite often when we look at other beings, especially these days, now that we're using social media a lot and we're constant in our smartphones and tablets and whatnot, these days, quite often when we look at other beings, we don't really see them as beings. We don't actually perceive their mind, not directly, but indirectly at least. And we don't recognize that the person I'm looking at actually right now is having emotional experiences, feelings, thoughts, moods, and so on that are just as real as mine. We don't realize that. That's something that psychiatry has been studying in quite a lot of depth, and in psychiatry that's called theory of mind. Psychiatry studies whether theory of mind, this understanding that others are real subjects of experience, their own experience. Psychiatry studies whether that theory of mind develops for every human, develops at a certain age or not, and whether other sentient beings have it, whether, for example, monkeys have a theory of mind. Whether for monkeys, for instance, kittens are a real subject of experience. So they know that they can just take a kitten and tear it apart. And zoopsychology, the psychology of animals, has effectively proven that yes, at least other higher primates do understand that these other beings, for example kittens, do have their own mind, do have their own consciousness, their own real experience. And that's why you see gorillas and chimpanzees, especially gorillas, adopting kittens as their pets. It's quite amazing to see. You know, not every human understands that animals have their own experiences and should thus be treated in a compassionate manner. But we also see that not every human has that present at all times. We know that some beings are completely devoid of that theory of mind, and that's what is called a psychopath. A psychopath is a person who, through sometimes neurological damage, sometimes conditioning, and in many cases it's both and many other factors. Psychopath is a person that doesn't at all acknowledge the reality of other beings' minds. So for a psychopath, there's absolutely nothing ethically wrong with killing people and cheating people and treating them as garbage or treating them as toys and all that, because there's completely zero understanding that you are as real as I am. There's completely no, what is called in science, affective empathy. This resonance between us that tells me you're just as real as I am. Which from a Buddhist point of view is still a valid statement. Just the Buddhism would they say, you're also equally as unreal as I am. We're both not very real, honestly speaking. But we're both functional people, you know? I have a mind that has emotions and feelings and moods. You have the same. And it might be a good practice for me, for quite a few years even, to simply learn to see that. Actually, one of my friends works in business consulting in the United States, and for several years now, in business consulting, of course, many companies want to bring in mindfulness you know, Google, Apple, Sony, British Parliament, all that, people want to teach meditation to their employees. And then the next thing that they want to bring about, and there's quite a lot of literature on it and popular videos and promotional materials, is empathy. Just being able to see another being as having experiences, which is very understandable from a cultural point of view, because there's been quite a lot of barriers in the United States between different social groups, and quite a lot of problems with seeing the validity of the experiences of others. If you're the oppressed group, it's very difficult to see certain validity in your oppressor. If you're the oppressor, obviously, you don't really see the oppressed as real human beings. And so there's a lot of problems with that. But then one thing that my friend has been bringing up in all the business meetings over and over and again is that the next step after seeing others as real, the next step after empathy is compassion, and it's severely lacking as something that's being promoted. So many companies want to bring in empathy training, and you almost never, at least in the United States, yet hear, and there's certain change in that as well, but generally, we don't hear that often that company wants to bring in compassion training, which is the next step after empathy. Not just seeing the validity of another's experience, but also wishing them freedom from suffering, that's compassion, may you be free from suffering, and wishing them happiness, may you be happy, that's love or loving kindness. This verse is teaching us to do exactly that. Hold others as dear at all times, and not just dear as in like, oh, you're of value because you have status, or you have the looks, or you have money, or you're laughing at my jokes, but seeing them as beings that are dear and that are subjects of their own experiences, that I am wishing happiness to, freedom from suffering to. So the cognitive exercise that we do with this verse is, and we will do it right now for 1 minute, not as a meditation, just exercise that we do without even changing the posture. You don't need to do anything. It's just to notice all the others in this room, and we have several people here, and apply mental effort to see each one of the people here has their own experiences right now. They're happy or unhappy, they have emotion, moods, thoughts, and so on. And they're part of the same interdependence that brings about everything good that I have, including all my talents, all my knowledge, all my understanding. And they're also a support for me to develop love and compassion, and eventually become awakened through that. Without these beings, there would be no love and compassion that I could generate, because there would be no object. I can only develop love and compassion for beings, not for objects that are inanimate. So just take a moment to recognize that, and we'll do that for a few seconds, just quietly on our own, trying to adjust our mental state to perceive all the others in this room in this way. And then also trying to expand that to the outside. We hear some people talking outside and making sounds and driving cars and so on. And we can apply the same mental effort to see them in that same way. They're equally real, they're part of the interdependence, they're bringing about benefit, and I can develop love and compassion for them. And that's that. That's the whole exercise. And that's actually the way we're applying this verse in our daily life. You're on a bus, for example, or on a plane, going home. or you're walking a busy street here, or just walking around in a park. The training is, you notice a being. Oh, actually, you might be having dinner with your friend, you know. But then you take a second, and nobody has to know about this. It's your private business. Take a moment. You look at your friend as if anew, as if you're seeing them for the first time. You recognize that right now they're having valid personal experiences. You recognize that they're part of the same interdependence where everything good comes from everybody together. And you notice how precious they are. There's a connected practice that I very much like, which I've learned from a teacher, American teacher in the Japanese Zen tradition, Jen Bays. And the practice is called loving gaze. And the essence of practice is very easy, but it's not easy to always remember to do that. The practice is that you just look at someone, and it's if you were with your eyes saying, how wonderful that you exist. That's the whole practice. So we look at people all the time, right, anyway? And quite often we'll look at them with all sorts of emotions, very often with indifference. Sometimes with irritation, sometimes with frustration, sometimes with desire even, at least the desire for their attention, or notice me, I'm so special, you know, or anything. But here we're consciously sort of learning to add that component to our gaze. Just how wonderful it exist. If we want, we can add that, may you be happy, that's loving kindness. But just how wonderful that you exist in itself is such a game changer, because immediately it changes even our face. It changes our attitude, and it's something that people will start noticing, I should say. People do pick up on those social cues, they do pick up on our facial expressions, and animals pick up on our hormonal tones and smells very, very much, and all of that is dependent on our thinking and our emotions. And so people will be noticing if we're looking at them with a, how wonderful that you exist, or, oh God, not you again. That's something that I can very confidently say from my experience, because as a translator, when I translate for oral teachings and people start asking questions, that's something I don't like. I find it easy to answer questions myself, but trying to translate a convoluted question to the teacher and then get an answer back, that's one of the most difficult parts of the translator's job. Because people don't ask clear questions usually. They start like giving a talk for 5 minutes and there's no question mark at the end. You know, you're left trying to figure out what the hell just happened. And as a translator, and that's something I'm actually known for in Moscow when I translate, I started having like sort of weird facial expressions when people start asking questions like, what the hell are you asking, you know? And it's been my practice to try to change that into more, oh, how wonderful that you exist. You know, whatever the hell you're asking, even if it doesn't make any sense, and it goes on and on and on, I can always clarify later, like, what was the question? Right now, how wonderful that you exist. And I'm not sure whether anybody's noticing or whether it's a benefit to others, but it's certainly a lot of benefit for me, because it helps me to not dehumanize the person just because they're asking a question that from my completely subjective point of view is strange or inappropriate. And there's a lot of that goes into any other job that we might be doing, especially all the service providing, whether we're a medical profession or a server or pretty much anything, but also just like in daily life. So that's just the first verse. I think there's already in itself a lot of material for practice here. And one way to work with these 8 verses that I find helpful, in addition to just reciting them every day like the Dalai Lama suggests, and thinking, oh, have I been able to do this? Have I been able to do this? Have I been able to do that? Or reading in the beginning of the day and thinking, oh, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that. One other way that I can suggest, and that I've tried myself, is write each verse on a separate card, and then use that card for just one card, one of the 8 cards, not all 8 at the same time, for one day or 1 week. So just think, oh, this week I'm going to be practicing this specific verse. I'm going to be really exercising in it. I'm going to be carrying the card around. It's going to be on my phone. I'm going to be thinking about the meaning, and I'm going to think about it at the beginning of the day, and the middle of the day, and the end of the day, things like that. We all know how habit building happens. But then really coming back to it and trying to build this new way of interpreting reality and approaching beings. Any questions about this one? Anything that you found challenging or not easy to understand or interesting? The essence of the practice is seeing every being as precious. And from the Buddhist point of view, they're precious because we will be able to attain awakening for their benefit and with regards to them by developing love and compassion towards them and so on. But on a more universal level, just wow, everybody is precious when we start looking at them that way.
And when you say to have compassion to other people, is there any different line between realize the others are also, they might have doubts in life, or they might suffer, or they might sometimes not being happy?
Yeah.
Is it good to find the compassion through that? You know, like
Through understanding that they're also suffering and so on.
Yeah.
Actually, that's a necessary first step. Compassion just takes it a tiny bit further. So you could say that understanding that others suffer is part of empathy. Empathy is that mental function that recognizes what the others are experiencing. So for example, you might be having a headache right now, and I'm looking at you and I'm seeing you're not comfortable right now. You know, that's empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And then thinking more universally, I can think, well, there's also 700 million other people on this planet that are right now also having a headache, not to mention every human is facing sickness, old age, and death, you know, those sorts of things. So that's all still that understanding. What compassion adds to it is an aspiration. Compassion from a Buddhist point of view, and that's something that science has been adopting as well. From a Buddhist point of view, compassion is an aspiration that says, and may you be free from that suffering. So it's not just recognizing that you have a headache, it's also saying, may you be free from that headache. But obviously, universal compassion is not just about headaches, it's about every type of discomfort that we can overcome. So it is necessary to recognize that others are suffering. And it's also very necessary to recognize the ways in which they suffer, which is why the Buddhist tradition goes into great depth in talking about, oh, the animals suffer like this, and the beings in hell suffer like this, and that's like covered in quite a lot of depth. Why? Because knowing all the permutations of suffering, all the varieties of it, makes our compassion so much stronger. So it's a necessary first step, but then we need to have that aspiration, and that in itself is compassion, that we start to cultivate in meditation and in daily life. Let's just briefly cover verse 2 and then make a short tea break. This one is also quite outrageous and radical, and this one actually usually causes more objections than the first one. So it says, when in the company of others, I shall always consider myself the lowest of all, and from the depths of my heart hold others dear and supreme. What do you think the typical objection is in the Western society?
typical objection.
Objection, yeah. Like people say, oh, I'm not going to do that because...
You have to be self-confident, blah, blah, blah.
Exactly. So one way is to say, we have to be self-confident, and another way is to say, oh, we're already so self-hating, and we already have so much problems with the self-esteem. If we start seeing ourselves the lowest, well, that's just the end. You know, we're just going to get even more depressed and hopeless. That's a valid objection, actually, and it just then leads to the whole discussion of what's the balanced way of understanding this verse. Because, and as it says here in the commentary, without falling into low self-esteem and self-denigration. So one thing to notice, there's quite a lot of language in Tibetan Buddhism specifically that talks about overcoming selfishness, or not being selfish, or not being too self-cherishing, and eventually overcoming self-cherishing at all, like completely. And it's quite common, especially it was in the beginning when Buddhism was just coming to the West, it was quite common to not interpret that correctly. So people would be thinking, oh, I have to overcome self-cherishing, therefore I should stop showering and stop exercising and stop eating healthy food and not watch any movies and not have coffee that I like and not hang out with friends. I should constantly devote myself to the suffering of others and try to help them and only think about others. That has never been what the Buddhist tradition suggests. Even for yogis who are advanced enough to go and live in a cave, there's still a certain level of self-care, as we call it these days, that's completely necessary. And in one of the greatest books on altruism in the Buddhist tradition, called The Bodhisattva's Way of Life by Shantideva, these 8 verses are a distillation of that much larger text. Even there, it says very clearly that in order to be able to help others diligently and with enthusiasm, we need to be taking breaks. We need to be getting enough rest. We need to be taking enough care of our body and mind. Otherwise, we're just going to burn out, and it's not going to be helpful for anyone. There's quite a lot of Buddhist literature on burnout these days for that reason. And quite a lot of research done together by scientists, psychologists mostly, and Buddhist contemplatives on how to use different practices for overcoming, for example, medical burnout, which is when doctors and nurses just can no longer cope with the suffering that they have to face. So, if we were seeing ourselves as the lowest of all, as in, oh, I'm the worst person in this room, and I'm the worst of all, and you guys are all supreme, that wouldn't be very helpful. Because for one, if I didn't have any self-confidence, I wouldn't be sitting here and talking at all. I'd be like, oh, no, I don't know anything, which I don't, by the way. But it would also be completely paralyzing. I have enough confidence in the material and my ability to talk some sense to be speaking to you all, but I also know not to think too much of myself, because it's what I'm saying is incredibly limited compared to what you would find in great commentaries on this text and from masters who have generally realized all this stuff and so on. And even if I was like really the hot stuff, in any case, me like talking to myself right here would be absolutely nothing compared to your own personal experience of these things that comes about through your practice. So here, seeing ourselves as the lowest of all means seeing the relativity of our good qualities. So I might be a decent translator, or maybe not, but I always know there are people who are more skilled as translators than I am. But at the same time, there are always people that are less skilled. So I shouldn't be saying, oh, I'm not going to translate, because I know then people who are less qualified than I would take that same job and do not as good, you know? But at the same time, I shouldn't be thinking, oh, I'm the greatest translator ever, obviously. Because that's simply not true. It can never be validly true that we're the best in anything. But we can be quite decent in something. And if we're continuing to develop our skills and our qualities and our compassion and all that, we have every reason to practice self-respect and rejoice and feel happy about ourselves. So here it means that we're contracting arrogance and partiality by seeing how all of our qualities are relative to the qualities of others. There's always a better translator. There's always a better, pretty much anyone, right? A person better at teaching, person better at loving, person better at being compassionate, a person better at, I don't know, brewing coffee, whatever. But it doesn't mean I have to feel bad about myself, because there's no other person with this unique combination of qualities. There's better translators, just from a professional point of view, there's better translators than I am, but they could not in their life give a talk. I can sort of give talks sometimes. I'm not the best at that, but there are some incredible speakers that cannot translate, you know? So even in those two qualities, I can find, through their unique combination, enough self-respect to know I am of value in different situations. But I can also completely and honestly say, I'm not the best translator in the world, I'm not the best teacher in the world, I'm not the best meditator in the world, I'm not the best friend in the world. I'm quite okay. And I'm working to get better. But from this vantage point, having this level of self-respect and confidence, and knowing that there are others who surpass me, I can offer respect to all of you, to all the others, by knowing everybody in the room surpasses me in something. Absolutely. No doubt. I mean, for example, there's two native English speakers here. So obviously your English is better than mine. And then your Spanish is certainly better than mine. I know like 3 words. So even from that point of view, you surpass me in Spanish, in English. Wow, incredible. I might learn more English. Certainly hope to learn some Spanish eventually, but right now you surpass me. And that's already a reason for me to respect you, to practice respect without putting myself down in a neurotic way. So that's what the verse is about. When we practice it, learning to see that everybody in the world surpasses us in something, even cats and dogs. Dogs are better at being loyal than us, no doubt. Cats are better at being, like elegant and fluffy or whatever. Ants are being more hardworking than we are. Then we kind of already change the fixation on the ego that we have, where we absolutely have to be the best or not be at all. Or we have to be incredibly insecure and be incredibly jealous about anyone that might surpass us at work or anywhere else. But also, seeing others as dear and supreme helps us with the practice of the first verse. Because when we learn to see the good qualities of others, their skills, their talents, their love and their compassion and their patience and whatever, we are more able to also hold them as dear or see them as precious. Oh, they're precious because they have this skill, they have this talent, this quality, and actually they have a unique combination of wonderful qualities that it just takes time to recognize and see. So 1 minute exercise before we break for tea. Just sitting as we are, thinking about all the others in this room, or maybe other people in our life, and trying to see them as dear and supreme in their own ways. And that's it. Let's take a tea break and then look at the rest of the verses.